sorry, to step behind the finished page and into the mind of a writer who has helped shape how we see and understand our region. We're honored to welcome Wayne Wood, author, architectural historian, artist, and one of Jacksonville's most respected civic voices. Through his books and his lectures and preservation work, Wayne has spent decades documenting the visual and cultural history of Northeast Florida. His work reminds us that buildings are just not structures. They're stories, memory, and identity made visible. What makes Wayne's perspective so compelling is the way he brings together careful research, artistic sensibility, and a deep civic commitment. He doesn't just record history to me, he helps communities recognize its value and see their surroundings with fresh eyes. Today, we're going to explore the backstory behind his books, how they began, how they were researched, and what they reveal about this wonderful place that we call home. So, welcome everybody, and welcome Wayne. And Wayne, thank you so much for doing this for us today.
Oh,
We're going
thank
to
you, Sandy.
we're going to start off. I'm sending him the questions, but I may slip in a few. Okay, Wayne, I'm just going to tell you, I may slip in a surprise or two that I thought about last night. Uh, Nothing too personal. Okay. Uh, the first question that I wanted to talk to you about, Wayne, was that many people know your work, but I'd love to begin with you. Okay. What what first sparked your interest in history and architecture?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me, Sandy and Catherine. And it's nice to see a number of my friends on this program. Hello, hello, friends out there. Um, Good to see you, Francine. Um, so I was an English major at Emory University, and I wanted to be a writer and an artist. And I realized very quickly that I wasn't very good. And so I decided to become an optometrist. My uncle was an optometrist here in Jacksonville. And so I went to optometry school, and I figured you wouldn't have to be very smart to be an optometrist because the eye is only about that big. And how much would there be to learn? And so I also wanted to be my own boss and never be rich, never be poor, but just to have fun in life. And I took some courses in history at Emory, and I hated them. They were all about dead people and war. And so uh, when I came to Jacksonville in 1971, I lived in the old Riverside neighborhood, which was falling apart at the seams. The old houses that had been so grand from the turn of the century were falling into disrepair, and they were being divided up into duplexes, or even worse, being demolished. And one year, the hospital nearby tore down over 30 houses. And so a few friends of mine were sitting in my living room, and we decided that we would do something rather than sitting back. So that was the beginning in 1974 of Riverside Avondale Preservation. And in order to become a promoter for an old neighborhood like a chamber of commerce or a marketing group, we had to learn what we had. We had scenery, history, and beautiful architecture. So I had to learn about the history and architecture of the neighborhood. And in doing that, in 1976, as part of the National Bicentennial, I created this little book called A Walking Bicycling Tour of Riverside Avondale. That was the first book I had written. Actually, that's not quite true because back in college, I was editor of the humor magazine at Emory. And in the 1960s and 70s, I was part of the underground movement and did psychedelic posters and underground comic books. So if you count those, I've done more than 20 books, but that's the story for another day. And so then, so that was the first little book I wrote. It was about 60 pages and was quite well received. And then a few years later, accumulated all these pictures, and I did this book with Professor George Hallam called Riverside Remembered, which is filled with beautiful old photographs of the mansions along Riverside Avenue that was once known as the most beautiful street in America. Of course, all but two of those 50 mansions are gone today. Um, and then I did another book. We decided to do an exhibit in the Cummer Museum. So I did this book as a catalog for the Cummer. Now, we were talking earlier before we started about how I get started doing a book. I get punched in the face by a book. I had no idea that anybody needed a book on any of those things until all of a sudden there was this urgent need. And with my skills as a graphic artist and a publisher and a writer, what meager talents those may be, I could do books. And so now that I've done over 20 books, I like designing books and writing them and researching them as much as I do the actual reading of the book. And so as we go along, I'll talk about some of the other books I've done. But basically, my motto in life is if it's not fun, I won't do it. And everything that I try to do is in some way a work of art or about a work of art or to expand people's appreciation and understanding of the art that surrounds us. And certainly the theme of preservation with Riverside Avondale preservation is the neighborhood is art. In fact, uh, I've done more exhibits in the Cummer Museum than perhaps any other living person. The one I showed you the catalog for um, was the second one I've done. The first one I did was called The Neighborhood is Art. And literally, you walk outside the museum and you're in an outdoor museum of architecture. And so that was back in 1976. I did the first exhibit. And then I've done, each time I've had a major book come out, the Cummer's been gracious enough to allow me to do another exhibit. So I've done 5 exhibits in the Cummer Museum, and not a single one of my paintings has ever appeared in the Cummer. So there you go. So
Well, yeah.
let me just continue on to get started on the thread. So then I became a member of the Historic and Cultural Conservation Commission, which I became chairman and changed the name to Historic Landmarks Commission. And we decided to write a pamphlet on Jacksonville's buildings. There was no research done. Nobody had ever written a book on Jacksonville architecture, or actually a pamphlet. So as we started writing this pamphlet, it got bigger and bigger. And I said, well, let's make this into a book. And I told people, we'll have it out for Christmas. That was my bold statement. I just didn't tell them which year. 12 years later, Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage, which was the first really big coffee table size book that I've done, was published in December 1989, and it sold out in 10 days. So we knew we were on to something. That book went through 6 different printings. And I think it was on that the Times Union used to publish a bestseller list. It was on the bestseller list for over a year as #1. And it sold more books locally than any other book ever has. And so
Yeah.
it gradually went out of print. And as many of you know, a couple of years ago for the city's bicentennial, I did an updated version of it. The first version was in color, and this one was I'm sorry, the first version was in black and white, and this one was not only in color, but it included all of those buildings that were not eligible to be in the first book. A building has to be 50 years old to be eligible for the National Register. So the book we did 3 years ago included all those wonderful mid-century modern buildings that have, done by Taylor Hardwick and Bob Broward and so forth. So that's kind of how it was. The next chapter in the Punch in the Face story is, and after I became chairman of the Historic Preservation Commission, I also got on the board of the Jacksonville Historical Society. And Emily Liska, many of you know, was the executive director. And in a conversation with her one day in the year 2000, we said the 100th anniversary of the Great Fire of Jacksonville is coming up. Nobody's ever written a book about that. And so I said, okay, Emily, let's write it. And so that provoked me to write the Great Fire of Jacksonville book. And I'd always wanted to do a book with Bill Foley. Bill Foley was a beloved writer for the Jacksonville Journal and Florida Times Union, and he had cancer and he could no longer speak. So when he interviewed people, he wrote notes in a notepad and asked them questions. And so I, saw Bill and told him, let's write a book together on the Great Fire, and he agreed to do it. And unfortunately, he died after writing only the first 7 pages. So this book is actually a memorial not only to the Great Fire, but also to Bill Foley, my friend and journalist. So that's kind of tells the story of how you're going along, minding your own business, having fun, and all of a sudden something comes along and punches you in the face and said, okay, you got to do this. And that's what I did.
Okay, let's talk about that writing and research because it goes hand in glove. When you begin a new book, where does it start, Wayne? With a place, a story, or a question? You've kind of talked about that, uh, and your books feel both scholarly and they also are accessible. How do you balance that research and that storytelling? Because you're a great storyteller.
Well, thank you. And a great story is the longtime maven of the Jacksonville Historical Society was named Dina Snodgrass. She was a white-haired woman, very stern. I never saw her smile in my life, but she was very serious about history. And one of the newsletters that Riverside Avondale Public Preservation published, it had an error about who the architect was for a particularly noteworthy building. I didn't write the article, but she took it out on me and she called me up and chewed me out and said, if you're going to write something down, it better be correct. The truth. I've said you're right, and I have a motto that the truth is just as interesting as what you can make up. And so it's really important if you write a book or even write an article that is published in the media, it needs to be accurate because 100 years from now, people are going to go back like I do and read books from a long time ago and rely on that for a factual representation. And so that has been my motto. And I've only written one book of historic fiction, which nobody can prove anything in that book is not true, although I had to make a lot of it up because it's a story and nobody can go back in time and record conversations. So it's important to use the resources we have. Locally, we have the Jacksonville Historical Society. It has a wonderful archive of photos, documents, and so forth. The Jacksonville Public Library is a terrific collection of Florida documents, books, photos, and so forth. Uh, they have old sandboard fire insurance maps, which are really important in documenting Jacksonville's architectural history because every 7 years or so, this fire insurance company would come out and produce these huge maps. They weigh like 50 pounds each in detail, showing a diagram of all the buildings in town. So you can tell if a building was made of brick, if it was 6 stories or 2 stories, so that somebody couldn't come along and say, my building burned down. It was a 6 story building. Please pay me insurance for that. When really, these maps would prove it was only a 2 story building. So those are great. We have microfilm with all the old newspapers. And until this past year, the Florida Times Union and Jacksonville Journal and Metropolis newspapers were only available on microfilm, which is a mind-numbing, eye-blinding effort to go through and search through microfilm to find particular pages and random. And just this past year, they're now online on Ancestry on newspapers.com, which you can just plug in a word that says like Bill Foley, and it'll show you all the mentions of that person's name. So terrific. Also online, there are wonderful sources of books. Books are generally written at a time uh, congruent with the actual historic events. And although I have my own big collection of historic reference books, the Historical Society does and the library does, there are many books that are out of print or unavailable. And also, if you're sitting at your computer in your pajamas researching a book, you don't have time to go down to the library and look and check it out. So there are um, resources like the Haiti Trust, which has hundreds and hundreds of old books online that you can scroll through. And that Haiti Trust is spelled Haithi. Um, and there's also the Wayback Machine on Internet Archives that has lots of old books. Many magazines are online, like all the old Florida Institute of Architects books are online. And there are many books, of course, you can find that you didn't know existed. This is the coolest thing about researching because, first of all, you have to, when you start a book, and that was the beginning of this rambling question, answer to your question, is you have to say, okay, here is the topic. What do we need to find out? And then you say, what are the resources to find out that information, whether it be books, newspapers, which are terrific resources, going back ancestry and learning family histories, what people are alive who could provide that information. But the greatest thing about it is once you start that path, then you find out what you don't know. And what you don't know is almost more important than what you do know. And you have to be a detective and figure out how to find that out. And the discovery process is just delightful because you find things that you need to know that you didn't know you needed to know. And it just smacks you in the face and said, okay, this is where it is. Or sometimes you will find one word in a book that piques the question of, well, what does that mean? How does it relate to this? And you start researching that one word or phrase or fact, and it leads you down a whole other rabbit hole. And it's truly like being a space traveler, a detective, and going back in time and forward in time all at once.
Okay, well, I'm going to follow up on that one with this question. Have you ever uncovered something in your research that just completely surprised you? I'm sure, or changed your understanding of Jacksonville.
Well, that's a good question. Let me pull out a book here. I've got a stack of them, so let me move things around a little bit. So this book is called Life, The Untold Story of Charles Adrian Pillars. Pillars was the sculptor who did the Memorial Park statue. And so there are two stories that answer your question about this book. As an optometrist, I examine patients, like I have several patients here on our call today. Um, and one was Diane Daywood, a delightful friend, and she said, I'm going to write a doctoral dissertation, something about art. What could I write about? And I said, you know, I don't know anything about the guy that designed the Memorial Park statue. It is the greatest outdoor work of art in the state of Florida, much less in Jacksonville. And yet, if somebody was, why is he not famous? And so I said, why don't you write a book about him? And that way I'll learn about him. And she said, nah, I'm not interested in that. And then about 2 months later, she called up and said, Wayne, I'm on it. I'm writing my doctoral thesis on Charles Adrian Pillars. And so she wrote her thesis on the statue itself and the art behind it and a little bit about pillars. But that gave me even more questions. If he was this good a sculptor, where are all the rest of his work? Why don't we have statues of his work on every corner? And so I began researching, and the deeper I got into it, um, the more I realized that this was the most amazing story I'd ever heard in my life. Um, and he had two daughters who were elderly, and Diane interviewed one while she was still alive, and then she passed away. And the other one I interviewed, she was in her 90s in a assisted living facility. And she told me, I interviewed her and she told me about her father's work and a little bit about growing up. And so I about exhausted her. It had been an hour. And so I put down my clipboard at the end of that time. I said, okay, Ruth, that was all great. What was your father really like? And she says, well, I remember her hands were going like this. She said, well, When I was 8 years old, one morning I came down into the kitchen and there was my father on the floor choking my mother to death. And I looked up on the counter and saw that big butcher knife, and I knew I was going to stab him in the neck. But you're not going to put that in your book, are you? It's in the book.
It's a great story.
And then I asked, so that was the most startling thing because I had studied all the stuff about the sculptor. I knew his life, I knew where he grew up, I knew where he did his education and all that. And all of a sudden, the entire book changed just like that. And
Oh,
then I also asked her, I said, well, do you have any photographs of your family and father? And she said, well, I might have a few in that closet back there. And I left that interview with two huge boxes of everything, all the family history, photographs, which makes his book remarkable because Pillars never wrote anything down. He is psychologically a very complicated person, as you'll read. If you don't have the book, it is on sale in the Episcopal bookstore, and I hope you'll get it because it is a rollicking story that goes everything starting from the Chicago World's Fair of 1893 to Paris to Jacksonville in the 1890s to the Ringling Circus to the Great Depression. And it's a remarkable story of tragedy and triumph for one man. So I hope you'll enjoy it.
oh, I'm
I
gonna get that one.
like my book, Jacksonville Architectural Heritage. I would estimate that that book has over 10,000 facts in it. And digging up every fact and making sure it's correct and finding the sources is part of what makes it being a delight to write a book and to have my own sense of discovery that I then get to share with my readers who hopefully will not just look at the pictures, of which there are hundreds and hundreds in those books, but also read the story and go through the same journey of discovery that I did.
Oh, wow. Okay, now we're gonna just kind of turn the corner just a little bit, and we're going to talk about architecture. You have helped many of us learn how to read buildings, literally. What should people look for when they're trying to understand a structure or a streetscape? And how do you think, I'm going to combine both of these, how do you think architecture reflect the values or the aspirations of a community at a given time? I kind of both, if you can kind of touch on those.
Well, architecture is the most public of all the arts. I mean, if you think about it, we share them as a community every day. We drive past buildings that we look at and say that's cool, um, these are buildings that are not hidden in a museum or a gallery. They're out there for all of us to enjoy. And I've learned over time that we share those as a community. Every community has three or four favorite buildings, and they connect all the people in the community who have some sort of vague ownership. And that's kind of a tenet of preservation. I drive by a house on St. John's Avenue once a week, and it's got the most beautiful door of any building you've ever seen in your life. And I just wonder sometimes if the owner would destroy that door or alter it or close it in, even though that person owns that building. I own a stake in that building, and we as a community share and own that building. So architecture is a community resource, and it is the most public of all the art. But on the other hand, and ironically, architecture is the most fragile of all the arts. A building is made of stone and steel is far less likely to survive centuries than a poem or a play or a book or a symphony. And so, with that in mind, um, the way I've gone about my task of being a leader in the preservation movement is to make people understand why a building is important. What are the stories behind it that might endear it to a reader or a citizen who says, well, it's just another old building. Why should we save it? So it's the stories and the artistry in a building that makes it worth saving. When I wrote Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage back in the 70s, I posed this question for every building that we selected because obviously we couldn't do every old building and every old building in Duval County. If my father, who had no interest in architecture whatsoever, were standing on the sidewalk in front of that building with me, what could I tell him about that building that might make him love it? Either the story, the history of it, pointing out the artistic details, or just the reason that it was meaningful to our community. So that's kind of been my benchmark. I've always, since I'm not was not raised as a historian, an English major, optometrist, you might say, well, gosh, how do you become a historian? Well, hard work, but also you have to be able to uh, say what happened here. The old adage, history is just about dead people and wars, is why it's so boring. But then if you turn the tables and say, what happened right here in this place, where you're standing now, why is this place significant? How can we share that with others to make them appreciate what happened here and what's important? And even more salient is how can we make it important to generations in the future, a century from now? How can we, first of all, preserve what is good and beautiful in our current environment? And then how can we interpret it and make it palatable to people along in the future so they will then have the same affection for it that we do today, and being able to transmit that importance to generations unborn in the future is a pretty heavy duty challenge, really. And that's why books, which can survive more than the buildings themselves, are my chosen way of communicating with the future.
Okay, I think that what you said is leading into my next questions for you. You've long been involved in preservation efforts, and I think you've touched on this, but maybe just hit it again because, I'm a former school teacher and I believe in repetition. All right. Why does preservation matter? Not just historically, but for our community's future. And how do you help people connect emotionally to places that they might otherwise overlook? And this is real important to me because I'm president of a very struggling preservation society now in Green Cove Springs, and we've we were able to save one building. Now we're in the process of saving another one. How, in your view, what is the greatest untold story in Jacksonville? Do you think that so far? What's your next project, Wayne? The greatest untold story.
Well, I could be snarky and say, I have no idea. If I knew what the next
You
great thing
could.
was, I'd be doing it now.
You
Uh,
could.
I there
Preserve. Yeah.
So let me just do a little side story and then I'll come back to it.
Okay.
So I'm not really great at any one thing. Actually, I was a great optometrist. I love being an optometrist. I wrote a book about optometry that was a bestseller, but that's neither here nor there. Um, what I like to do is I'm a photographer, an artist. I do painting and sculpture. I write books and I do lectures. I do lectures all over the state of Florida, and it's fun sharing my knowledge with them. But among those talents, um, photography is one of the great ways to communicate that emotional aspect you were referring to people. Every photo in the books that I do, I treat like a portrait of taking a picture of a baby in a studio. You want to get the best light, the best angle, and they're all my babies in some way. So when you take a picture of a building, you can catch just the right light and the right angle, which sometimes requires going back a number of times to take a picture of it, that shows the essence of that, the beauty of that building. And so photography is a great way to communicate that emotional part of it. Telling a story is, and being a storyteller is important to get people excited. When I was doing a lecture the other day at St. John's Cathedral about the Great Fire, when it came that moment when the old warehouse factory where the building blew up, I raised my voice and made a loud noise, and it blew up. And so I'm continually frightening people in my lectures with my emotional outbursts. So um, you're dealing with preservation there in Green Cove Springs, and the best thing you can do is get people involved, telling a story, making them appreciate it as a community asset, um, and also getting their buy-in by, sweat equity, have them commit money and do work and um, do more than just look at a two-dimensional picture of a book. The reality of it is our heritage is very fragile and it goes away so quickly that everything we can do emotionally to connect with people, which is luckily the talents that God gave me to communicate to people, help save buildings.
What do you think is still left untold? Boy, you've hit a lot in all of your books and lectures and just in the preservation work you've done. But what do you think is left untold in Jacksonville that
Yeah, well, I was getting to that, and I got carried away by shouting so loud, I even forgot myself. So, in the past 2 months, I've done 12 lectures in various parts of the state of Florida. One of those was less than a month ago. I did a lecture in Riverside Church, former Riverside Baptist Church, on avant-garde architecture, which is a pretty much untouched subject of buildings in Jacksonville that are not just a particular style, but are extraordinary in their construction and their visual qualities. And so Preston Haskell, noted Jacksonville citizen and patron of the arts, was in that lecture, and he talked to Alan Bliss, who is in charge, who's the CEO of the Historical Center, and they said Wayne ought to do a book about that. And so Alan said, "Well, will you sponsor it?" And Preston said yes. So I'm hoping to have ready by the end of summer a new book on avant-garde architecture in Jacksonville. And again, 10 minutes before I gave that lecture, I had no idea I was going to do a book. And so it just came along and smacked me in the face and said, okay, here's a book. You got to do it. You're the only person that can do it. And the way I do books is every author wants to get their book published. Random House or Doubleday is never going to come and say, Wayne, we've decided you're a great author. We're going to publish your book. So I'm left with, you know, the struggle to write a book, produce it, research it, write it, and then to get it published comes the big lift because it costs money. Some of the books I've done cost $75,000 just to print them. And so I've had this mode for the last 8 books I've done. I find a patron. First of all, I have the idea and I sell it to a patron who's willing to pay to have the book printed. So the hard costs are done. I get to write it, research it, design it, lay it out, accumulate the photographs, and send that book to a printer. I'd go shopping to the different printers to find the best job. And the latest book I've done was printed in Shanghai, China. Cost a third as much. It's
wow.
amazing. And the quality is beautiful. And so then once they ship that book to Jacksonville in these big cartons, it goes to the Jacksonville History Center and they sell the books. I don't make a penny on any book I've ever done, except the book on optometry that I wrote that I made a killing on. But the Jacksonville History Center has these books, and then they have to sell them. And they sold some to the Episcopal bookstore, and the Episcopal bookstore gets to make a profit on it. So, from the investment of a patron to pay for the book, then every dollar that is the book price sells goes to my favorite nonprofit organizations as well as local bookstores. None of my books are for sale on Amazon.com.
Oh, wow. Now that's a story. That is a story. Okay. So
Actually, one book is for sale on Amazon.com. Let me see if I can.
what is
Yep,
that
I
one?
have it. It was a one-off book I did on architect Peter Rumpel's artwork, and the
Okay.
quickest way to get it published was to do it on Kindle and upload it, so it's print on demand. But that's the only book I have that you can buy on Amazon. Support your local bookstores. Um, they're
Oh,
such a valuable resource where you can
yeah.
actually go in and touch books and leaf through them and see them and feel them. And you might pay $1 more, you might pay $10 more, but oh, the rich resource you're helping to underwrite when you do that.
Okay, let's talk about your books now. Of all the books you've written, do you have a special baby that feels just especially personal to you?
Well, that's like saying, your favorite child.
I know,
The
I know.
book that I've gotten the most mileage out of, if you want to call it that, is Jacksonville Architectural Heritage, because it's been the biggest bookseller, biggest selling book in local history. And actually got funding recently to do yet a new version of it. When the bicentennial version came out 3 years ago, it sold out in less than a year, and it had been out of print for 10 years at that point. So I've got funding to do a slightly updated version of that that'll be out, and so hang on, it'll be ready for Christmas 2026 if all goes well. And it'll make a lot of money for local bookstores and make a lot of people happy. I love to go on neighborhood home tours in Arlington, San Marco, Springfield, Riverside, Avondale. And that book is said to be on more coffee tables than any other book in Jacksonville. I'm sure that's true.
And it
So
is.
what I do is when I go on a home tour, I take a pen with me and I'll slip in when nobody's looking and I'll go in and sign their book sitting on their coffee table and close it real quick and walk away. So in that regard, Jacksonville Architectural Heritage is, I guess, my baby. But that's not to say that the book on Charles Adrian Pillars, the sculptor who did the Memorial Park statue, is the most fascinating book I've done just because of the story that it tells. And then another book, this one is sadly out of print. It's the biggest book I've ever done. It's called The Jacksonville Family Album. Back 20 years ago or so, we realized the Jacksonville Historical Society had the greatest collection of old photos, many of which are museum quality. So I said, let's do a book of all these great photos, make a big photo album. And this goes back to the fact, even after the Civil War, every family in America had a family album because at that time, prior to that, unless you were rich and you had pictures painted of your relatives, when they died, they died. But now, when photography came along in the 1840s and 50s, everybody had a picture taken, and so there was a family album on every coffee on every in every house. And so this was an attempt to accumulate the greatest photos of Jacksonville from the beginning of photography all the way up until the Jaguars in one book. And this book is I don't know if I can show it to you, but I'll just open to a random page and you can see it's just a beautiful book of the greatest photographs ever taken in Jacksonville. And this is one of the exhibits the Cummer did of those photos in the Cummer Museum. So we went all. I decided not just to use the pictures in the Jacksonville Historical Society archives, but to go all over the world, Library of Congress, museums, libraries, and gather all the great photos of Jacksonville from the past, many from the 1860s and 70s and 80s, and put those in this book. And so that was a really fun task. And it in one place we have all those great photos of every era of Jacksonville history told through its photographs.
Just
So I
told
have to
this.
say this is one of the most enjoyable books I've ever done, just because um, we got to accumulate a collection of photos that otherwise would never have existed.
Okay, well now on the offside of that, which was your most challenging book that you did? Which one did you do sweat over?
Um, there are two books I did, three books I did for people who were dying. Many of the books that I claim to have published, I did not necessarily write all by myself. I did writing in every one of them, but many of them were collaborative efforts. And I had a friend named Bob Ragland, who is an Episcopalian, who is an anarchist, outside the box thinker, environmentalist, and he I first met Bob in the 1970s. I looked out my door, and riding down Riverside Avenue was an old guy with a long white beard riding a bicycle on Riverside Avenue with a bow in his beard like a bow tie. And I said, I've got to meet that guy. And he's such an eccentric character. And he accumulated all these boxes of letters and protests and things he did. And so he was dying. And I said, Bob, we've got to write down your book. So I went there and gathered all these boxes of stuff and helped him put together a book. I did the same thing for Fred Schultz. Fred Schultz, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, he was co-chairman of he was vice chairman of the Federal Reserve that saved the United States economy during the Jimmy Carter administration. He was an amazing character. He was president of the Cummer Museum, Barnett Bank. He was a major character, and he was dying, and he had hired somebody to write his biography, and it was terrible. And Fred called me up and said, "What can I do, Wayne? I've got this book. I want to publish it." And I said, Fred, I'll do it. And so I took the book and rewrote it. And the other guy's name is still on the book. I shouldn't embarrass him by calling attention to it. But I rewrote the book. And as Fred was on his deathbed, I took him a copy of it. I think I was the last person to talk to him because I went to visit him and went in the wrong door. And there he was lying in his sick bed. And the next day he died. And I showed him the book and got his response. And then another book like that was my friend Bob Broward, the famous architect who worked with Frank Lloyd Wright. He wrote a book on the Broward family, uh, which is the oldest and largest family in Florida, dating back to the 1740s. And he had been writing a book for years and had 12 banker's boxes filled with books, with material for this book. And so at one point, I just went over to his house and said, Bob, we got to get this thing done. So I took all those dozen banker boxes home and helped put together the book called The Broward Family in Florida from 1747 to 2001, and got it done while he was still alive to enjoy it. And so he wrote the book, and I made the book.
Oh, okay. Now let's talk about your art. All right. You're also an artist. How does, and I think you touched on that a little bit when you were talking, giving me some pointers about, photography. How does your artistic eye influence the way you write about history and also buildings? Because I know it does. It's got to.
Repeat the question again.
I said, how does your artistic eye influence the way you write about buildings and history? Because I know artists look at things. This is Art at Noon, and we talk about this all the time about how artists look, and they look different at things differently than the common person, I want to say.
Well, everything I do is art. Um, my life is art. My wife is a well-known artist. She's a sculptor. And I'm not really good at any one form of art, but I'm a sculptor, I'm a painter, I'm a poster artist, I'm a photographer, I've written plays, I've done movies, none of which are going to ever win any great awards, but I'd like to explore every facet of art I can, and so I don't see a boundary line between them by necessity. A book is different than a sculpture or a play, but at the same time, the same thread of creativity, communication runs through them. And any artist that has visions in their head or ideas in their head and wants to communicate them finds a medium to do that. And I've been lucky to be allowed to uh, explore all different mediums of art. And if it's not fun, I won't do it. And if it doesn't create something beautiful, Buckminster Fuller, the great engineer and scientist, once said, when I start out to make a project, I don't think of beauty. I think of the problem. And after I've solved the problem, if it's not beautiful, then it wasn't worthwhile. Even though that I didn't set out to make something beautiful, I set out to solve a problem. The beauty is not only in the process of creating it, but it's in the result that's through. And if you can't see the beauty in the work that you've done, then maybe it wasn't worth the time. Um, I'm a collaborative artist. most all the books I've done have been collaborations with at least one or two other people, and sometimes dozens of people, like Jacksonville Architectural Heritage. Over 200 people were contributors in some way to that book. Um, I recently did a sculpture that is called The Control Room in the Nautilus. And those of you that come by to visit my house can see it. I'll show it to you. It's a 9-foot sculpture that was started by steampunk artist Jim Smith. Jim was a beloved teacher at Bowles School and a steampunk artist. He did the wonderful steampunk decoration of Kickback's Pub on King Street. Some of you have been there and seen that. And so when he died over a year ago, he had all these elements in his studio that he was going to use to create sculpture with. And so I was lucky enough to go through and haul away a car full of his stuff, and one of them was titled The Control Room for the Nautilus Submarine. And there was this column and a couple of pieces to it. And so I got to take Jim Smith's initial idea and create this 9-foot sculpture that puts you in the control room for the Nautilus submarine. And the backstory of it is, which is totally spurious, it says artist Jim Smith discovered the remains of Jules Verne's 1871 Nautilus submarine and was able to salvage part of it, and was in the process of recreating the control room when he passed away in 2024. And artist Wayne Wood was assigned by the National Oceanographic Association to recreate this nautical treasure. Uh, and here, behold, is the control room for Jules Verne's 1871 Nautilus
See,
submarine, of course, which never existed.
I love it.
In my
Okay.
yard is a 14-foot chicken my wife made out of traffic safety cones. In our yard, we have many parts of old buildings that have been demolished, but they're beautiful architectural designs. And so they work both as works of sculpture, as history and architecture. And one of them is like 10 feet tall. We also have the big mouth in our yard that was once the gateway to the Mosh Children's Museum health exhibit that later traveled to Hemming Park and got badly broken and graffitied. So we moved it to our yard. So we have a 19-foot long big mouth in our yard that as recently as this morning, some strollers were passing by our yard and they were staring through the fence looking at it. And I invited them in and took their picture under the big mouth. And you're all invited if you come by for a visit to get your picture taken
Oh,
in our
oh,
sculpture garden.
I would love that. Okay, I know the answer to this, but I just want you to embellish on it because it's kind of coming to the close. I think it's a of our time together, and because we are an art program um, as well. Do you see architecture as a form of art? And if so, how should we experience it?
So,
And
how do you
architect,
mean that?
well, looking at it, and I'm thinking mainly, Wayne, about preservation too, because you touched on that a little bit when we were talking about taking the photographs and everything. Do you see architecture as a form of art? Um,
Well, yeah, as I said a while ago, architecture is the most public of all the arts. It is like every great sculpture that was ever created is built with an architect's eye to create something hopefully beautiful and meaningful. Sadly, much of modern architecture is not artistic and it is built for the cheapest possible manner for a budget-minded uh, developer. But when architecture is truly an embodiment of the human spirit, and it's meant to be beautiful and uplifting, and as we share it as a community, it is the most accessible of all the arts because, again, you don't have to go in a museum to see it. You don't have to sneak into my house to see the painting on my wall. You can just look at my house and enjoy it as a work of art. I often tell people who come for a tour of our yard art um, to stand out in front of my house. Look at it not just as a house or a building, but as a work of sculpture. And you see the interplay of horizontal and vertical lines, the abstract geometry that the architect consciously put into that, not only to make it a joy for people to be able to look out the windows and be communicating with nature, to stand on balconies and terraces and be connected with nature around you, but also so that passersby could look and see that somebody who lives in this house is symbolized by the beauty and the quality of what went into that house. So we all share architecture on a daily basis. My job is to write books about it and to make sure people know the stories that give an even further dimension that will make it valuable enough that we'll try to save those buildings that are important and significant.
Okay, now this is a question for me because this goes back a way, and I want to see if you remember this, okay? Many years ago, and I think it was before COVID, a group of you all got together to do like a radio show. Do you remember? And I think
Swamp Radio.
yeah, you did Swamp Radio. You did it several places, and one of the stories that you told, and I believe it was you, was there not a circus involved in Jacksonville? Uh, Somewhere there was something about a president and a circus, and it has just driven me crazy. Does that ring a bell with you at all?
Tell me the elements that you remember again.
I said the elements were there was a story about a circus or something in Jacksonville and a president. Was it McKinley or somebody that visited? You told so many great stories on that Swamp Radio. And I was trying to remember the other night. Uh, was there a
Yeah, that
circus somewhere
The
in Jacksonville?
Swamp Radio was an idea after Prairie Home Companion left public airways. It was a great sense of loss to me because Garrison Keillor was a great storyteller. So
Absolutely.
local playwright Ian Mears developed something called Swamp Radio. We had several of them on the stage at the Florida Theater, and I got to tell people I performed on the same stage that Elvis Presley did and so forth. Um, but anyway, so we had a wonderful group of 15 or so actors, singers, musicians, and my job was to be the historian and tell the story about several things from Jacksonville history. And the one you're referring to was the Subtropical Exposition. In 1888, Jacksonville had been a great tourist mecca after the Civil War, but in by 1888, the tourists went away. Henry Flagler built a railroad not to Jacksonville, but through Jacksonville down to St. Augustine, to the Ponce de Leon Hotel and others. So Jacksonville was struggling to maintain its destination as a tourist industry. And so they staged what was called the Subtropical Exposition, a mini World's Fair that was out on Main Street. And here I have a picture of it in my Pillars book. You can see it was quite an amazing edifice. And the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland,
Cleveland,
came to
Cleveland.
Jacksonville to inaugurate the fair. And of course, having the president come was a big story in itself. But the even bigger story was his wife, whose name was Frances Folsom Cleveland. And she was 24 years younger than him. And it was kind of a scandal. He was the only president to get married in the White House. He was the second fattest president we ever had, and she was the fashion plate. She was Lady Gaga of the era, and people wanted to see her more than the president to see what hat she wore and what gown she had on. And so it was a huge stir in Jacksonville, and the crowd that gathered on the veranda of the St. James Hotel was so big that the stairway caved in, and that was Jacksonville's visit from the president to see the subtropical exposition. So stories like that from history are colorful and get people inspired to learn more about our history, and that's why I love to tell them. And I'd love to have Swamp Radio come back. It's an expensive production, but it will be fun to get to tell stories on the Florida theater stage again.
That was just good. It was probably one we saw every single production that y'all did, and it was they were outstanding. Okay, I hate to end this up,
Oh,
but we have a few.
let me just ask Sandy, there are a couple of questions in the chat area. Do we have
Okay,
time?
we've got time for two or three. Okay,
There are
you want to ask
two of
me?
them in there. Yeah,
Okay,
let
can
me
you
grab
read them?
Yep. Okay, hang on.
Okay.
Okay, I'll do the first one from Mark. Wayne, you mentioned the Great Fire smoldered for a year and caught back on fire. Did I hear you correctly that the fire was relit exactly a year later in the grain storage basement? If this is correct, is there more to the story?
Yeah, I told this story on last Sunday when I gave my lecture on the Great Fire at St. John's Cathedral. Um, but it seems that one of the most important office buildings in town was the Mohawk Building on the corner of Bay and Main Street. And one of the tenants of that store was Tyson's Feed Store. And they had a basement that was filled with grain and corn and wheat and all kinds of cattle feed and stuff. And so that building, like all the other buildings in the heart of downtown, burned in the fire. When they cleared it away, they just pushed the rubble back and covered up that basement. And so several times during the year after the fire, which was May 3rd, 1901, the grain in that basement would continue to smolder because of the heat properties of spontaneous combustion, and smoke would come up out of this basement. And the site for the Mohawk building was left vacant for several years, one of the few lots in downtown that didn't get rebuilt on right away. And so, exactly a year to the day, May 3rd, 1902, at noon, just about the same time the Great Fire started, that basement filled with grain flared up and actually was burning up enough so that somebody noticed it and called the fire
Mm.
department. And Fire Chief Haney sent his pumper wagon down there and filled that basement with water. So, although in one sense, the Great Fire of Jacksonville had burned for over a year, but on that day, May 3rd, 1902, the Great Fire was put out for good.
Thank you. Okay, one question from Francine. Will Wayne tell us where one of the avant-garde houses is located? An example of one.
Okay, the avant-garde architecture is all over the city. I want you to think of the Chart House. If you ever go and
Yeah.
look at that, not as a building, but as a sculpture, it is fantastic. St. Paul's by the Sea Episcopal Church,
Mm,
designed by famous architect Blake Ellis from Atlanta, is like a soaring seagull's wings going up into the sky. Bob Broward's house in Arlington, called the Butterfly House, um,
mm.
is literally shaped like the wings of a butterfly. Uh, and there are many buildings like that designed by Clutho that, for their time, even back in the early 1900s, they were cutting edge, striking architecture, the likes of which nobody had seen, and they were astonishing. So, my theme in this new book is buildings that are visually stunning, that kind of break the rules. Think of the Hayden Burns Library, now the DuPont Center in downtown Jacksonville. This one block, city block building that has wings on it all over the place and is abstract in its geometry, and it's a stunning design. So there are probably 100 buildings in Jacksonville that either exist now or have existed. Sadly, many of them have been torn down. That'll be featured in this new book on buildings that will, every page you turn, you're supposed to say, wow.
Can't
Wow.
wait.
Yeah. Thank you, Francine.
Hey, thank you. Sandy,
Is
I'll
there
turn it back over to you.
Okay, as we come to the close of our time together, I'm struck by how much richer a place becomes when we learn to truly see it. And that is the gift Wayne Wood, thank you, has given to all of us. Through his work, we're reminded that history is just not distant, and it certainly isn't abstract. It lives in our streets, our buildings, our riverfront, and in the stories we choose to remember and share. Wayne, you have helped us understand that preservation is not simply about saving structures. It's about honoring identity, memory, and community. And we thank you, absolutely all of us gathered here today, for your time and your effort to bring to your research the clarity of your storytelling, your lifelong commitment to helping others see the beauty and the significance of this wonderful world around us. And to all of you that joined us today, may you leave with a renewed sense of curiosity, perhaps looking a little more closely at a familiar building, asking a few more questions, and recognizing that every place has a story waiting to be discovered. Thank you for being a part of Art at Noon's Backstory. And we invite you to join us the next time when we do our backstory, because we will have the director of Players by the Sea who is going to enrich us with all of the stuff and the good plays that are going on out there at the beach. Wayne, thank you. We're so honored you joined us.
Well,
And
you're
thank
very
all of you
kind.
for
You.
Thank you to everyone for being here. It's
Thank
a
you.
joy
Thank you.
sharing this time with you.
Great. And we do have copies of three of Wayne's
Yes.
books. So call us or go
Yeah,
online.
there are other books you might get Catherine to put in the bookstore. One in particular is this one.
Oh,
It's a book
yes.
by Bob Broward on the
Okay.
work of Henry John Clutho.
Okay.
I helped produce this book, and it's a wonderful book. It's still in print. Most of my
Great.
books, unfortunately, are no longer available, but the ones that are in print, you can buy through the bookstore or the Jacksonville History Center's website.
Great. Thank you
Thank
so much.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.